Billionaire's daughter had only 2 weeks left to live. The doctors had stopped offering treatments. The nurses spoke in hushed tones. The mansion stood cold and empty, filled only with grief and silence. Her father, lost in guilt and power, had already begun to say goodbye. But then there was the maid. She wasn't supposed to matter. She wasn't family. She wasn't even supposed to speak up. And yet, in the final days, when hope had vanished and everyone had turned away, she did something no one expected. Something so quiet, so powerful, so full of love, that when the billionaire finally saw it, it left him in tears. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Ellington lived in a sleek, modern mansion made mostly of glass and steel, perched on a hill overlooking the city. He was one of the richest men in the tech industry, known for building a global software empire from his college dorm room. But his success came at a cost. His wife had died suddenly 2 years earlier in a car accident, and since then, Richard buried himself in meetings, product launches, and late-night strategy calls. His 6-year-old daughter, Emily, stayed in the house with a rotating group of nannies, none of whom stayed long. They followed strict schedules, spoke in clipped tones, and never hugged her unless it was absolutely necessary. Emily, quiet and observant, spent most of her days alone in her room or wandering the empty halls of the massive house. She missed her mother terribly and didn't understand why her father was always gone. Emily wasn't just lonely, she was sick. A rare form of kidney cancer had been diagnosed months earlier, and despite multiple treatments, her condition kept getting worse. Doctors came and went, running tests, adjusting medications, and speaking in hushed tones that made Emily feel like a problem to be solved rather than a child to be comforted. She hated the hospital visits, the cold stethoscopes, the way nurses avoided eye contact when they thought she wasn't looking. At home, there was no one to hold her hand during the worst nights, no one to read her stories when the pain kept her awake. Richard occasionally checked in via video call from his office, promising to visit soon, but soon never seemed to come. Emily stopped asking when he'd be back. She began to believe that maybe he didn't want to be around her anymore, not because he didn't love her, but because she was broken, and broken things were hard to look at. The mansion, though stunning, felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was clean, organized, and untouched. There were no toys on the floor, no drawings taped to the fridge, no smell of cookies baking in the oven. The kitchen was spotless, used only by staff who came in during the day and left before dinner. Emily's room was neat, but it lacked the messiness of a real child's space. No stuffed animals piled on the bed, no crayons scattered across the desk. Even her favorite blanket, the one her mother had sewn for her, sat folded in a drawer, too precious to use now that it was all she had left. Richard had installed the latest smart home technology. Lights that turned on automatically, voice-controlled thermostats, security cameras in every room, but none of it could fill the silence. The house responded to commands, but it never responded to loneliness. Emily often sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the world outside move on without her, wondering if anyone would notice if she disappeared. Richard wasn't a bad man. He truly loved Emily, but grief had wrapped itself around him like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. He told himself that working harder would somehow fix things, that if he made more money, hired better doctors, built a better future, he could undo the past. He reviewed medical reports late at night, researched experimental treatments, and even funded a research lab in his wife's name, hoping it would somehow bring meaning to the loss. But he couldn't bring himself to sit by Emily's bedside. Every time he saw her pale face, her tired eyes, he felt like he was failing as a father. So he stayed away, convincing himself it was temporary, that he'd be there when she got better. but better never came. Instead, her hair started falling out in clumps, her appetite vanished, and she grew too weak to climb the stairs. The doctors stopped talking about recovery and started using words like comfort care and final days. Richard sat across from 3 specialists who explained in calm, professional voices that Emily's body was shutting down. There was nothing more they could do. They estimated she had only a few weeks left. Richard listened without speaking, his hands clenched under the table. He asked if there was any chance, any experimental drug, any trial overseas, but the doctors shook their heads gently. They had tried everything. On the drive home, Richard didn't cry. He just stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. When he finally entered the house, he found Emily curled up on the living room couch, wrapped in a thin blanket, watching cartoons with the volume turned low. She looked up and gave him a small, tired smile. He wanted to run to her, to hold her and never let go, but he froze in the doorway, unsure of what to say or do. That night, Richard sat outside Emily's bedroom door for hours, listening to her soft breathing through the crack. He thought about all the birthdays he'd missed, the school plays he hadn't attended, the bedtime stories he never read. He remembered how she used to run to the door every time he came home, shouting, "Daddy!" with her arms wide open. Now, she barely had the energy to lift her head. The doctors had said it was the end, and for the first time, Richard truly believed them. He knew he couldn't fix this with money or technology or power. All he could do was be there, but even that felt like too little, too late. Still, he made a silent promise to himself. For whatever time she had left, he would stay. He wouldn't leave her side again. He would hold her hand, tell her stories, and remind her every day that she was loved. It wasn't enough to change the outcome, but maybe, just maybe, it would be enough for her to feel less alone. Grace Williams arrived at the Glass Mansion on a rainy Tuesday morning, carrying a small suitcase and wearing a simple blue dress. She had been hired as a maid after the previous caregiver quit without notice, leaving Emily alone for 2 days until the house manager found a replacement. Grace was in her late 50s. A widow from Alabama who had lost her husband to a heart attack 5 years earlier and her only son in a car crash 2 years after that. She didn't talk much about her past, but people who met her often said she had a quiet strength and a warmth in her eyes that made you feel seen. On her first day, she walked through the silent halls of the house and immediately sensed something was off. The place was spotless, expensive, and completely lifeless. Then she met Emily, pale, thin, sitting on the floor with a coloring book, her eyes tired but curious. Grace knelt down, introduced herself gently, and asked if the girl liked pancakes. Emily just nodded, and for the first time in months, someone made her breakfast. From that day on, Grace stopped acting like just a maid. She cleaned, yes, but she also stayed in the kitchen longer than needed, humming old gospel songs while she cooked. She washed Emily's clothes by hand when the washing machine seemed too rough on her fragile skin. She sat with her during meals, even though the house rules said staff should eat separately. Grace told stories about growing up in a small town, about fireflies in mason jars, and fishing with her grandpa. She played simple card games, taught Emily how to braid friendship bracelets, and let her pick the movies they watched in the evening. Slowly, Emily started talking more. She laughed at Grace's silly jokes and even asked for seconds at dinner. Her cheeks got a little color back and she began leaving her room more often. The house didn't feel so cold anymore. Grace didn't try to replace anyone. She just showed up, day after day, with kindness and consistency. And that was enough to make a difference. Richard barely noticed the change. He came home late, sometimes not at all, and when he did, he stayed in his office or went straight to bed. He saw Grace as part of the background, another employee doing her job. He didn't realize that she was the one tucking Emily in at night, reading to her until she fell asleep, or holding her hair back when she got sick after treatment. He didn't know that Grace had rearranged the living room so Emily could sit closer to the sunlight, or that she kept a journal of the girl's symptoms because the doctor's notes seemed confusing. Grace never complained or asked for more. She just did what needed to be done. But as the weeks passed, she started paying closer attention to the medical visits. She noticed how the nurses spoke in low voices when they thought no one was listening. She saw how the doctor's reports used vague terms like "monitor closely" instead of clear explanations. Once she overheard a phone call where someone mentioned protocol deviations, and it stuck in her mind. Grace began asking gentle questions during doctor visits, pretending to be just a concerned housekeeper, but the answers didn't line up. One doctor said Emily's kidney function was stable. Another said it was declining rapidly. Blood test dates didn't match the lab results she accidentally saw left on the kitchen counter. Medication names changed without clear reasons. Grace had no medical training, but she had raised a child and cared for her sick husband. She knew when something felt wrong. She started writing things down in a small notebook she kept hidden in her room. Appointment times, names of staff, inconsistencies in what they said versus what was written. She even called the hospital once, pretending to be a relative, just to confirm if a certain test had really been ordered. It hadn't. That's when she realized this wasn't just bad communication. It was something deeper. Someone was hiding something, and Emily was the one suffering for it. Grace knew she couldn't stay quiet. She didn't go to Richard right away. She wasn't sure he'd listen, and she didn't want to cause panic without proof. Instead, she started spending more time at the hospital during Emily's visits, sitting quietly in the corner, watching how the staff interacted. She noticed that one nurse always avoided eye contact with Emily and rushed through checkups. She saw how the lead oncologist never stayed long and always left before answering Grace's questions fully. And she found a discarded lab slip in the trash can outside Emily's room, marked inconclusive. But the official report said positive response. Grace kept the slip. She also started asking other nurses small questions when the main team wasn't around. One younger nurse, looking nervous, told her off the record that Emily's file had been flagged for special handling, but wouldn't say more. Grace's gut told her this wasn't normal. She knew rich families sometimes got special treatment, but this felt different, like someone was covering up a mistake or worse. She decided she needed to dig deeper, even if it meant risking her job. Grace spent her free time researching online, comparing Emily's symptoms and treatment plan with standard protocols for her type of cancer. She found major differences. Some drugs Emily was taking weren't even approved for children her age. Others were being given in doses that didn't match guidelines. She printed out pages of information and tucked them into her notebook. One evening, while helping Emily bathe, she gently asked if the doctors ever hurt her or made her feel scared. Emily hesitated, then whispered that one man in a white coat made her lie still for a long time and said not to tell Daddy. Grace's heart sank. She held Emily close and promised she'd protect her. That night she made a decision. She would find out the truth, no matter how hard it was. She didn't know who to trust, but she knew one thing for sure. Something didn't add up, and she decided to investigate. Grace started her investigation quietly, careful not to raise suspicion. She used her access as a housekeeper to look through the pile of medical documents that arrived weekly. Lab reports, treatment summaries, billing statements. At first, she didn't understand much, but patterns began to emerge. Some medications listed on the daily chart weren't in the official prescriptions. Others had no clear purpose, and their names didn't match what the doctors mentioned during visits. She also noticed that test dates were sometimes changed on printed reports. Blood work supposedly done on a Tuesday would later appear in the file as having been done on Thursday, with different results. Grace began taking notes in her small notebook, writing down every inconsistency. She asked the kitchen staff and the night nurse small, casual questions about deliveries and doctor visits. Most didn't know much, but they trusted her because she never gossiped and always helped out. Slowly, she built a clearer picture. Something inside Emily's care wasn't right, and it wasn't just a mistake. One afternoon, Grace approached the head nurse, a stern woman named Ms. Delaney, during a routine checkup. She asked why a certain drug, listed as for nausea, was being given even though Emily hadn't vomited in days. Ms. Delaney looked at her like she was an insect. "That's not your concern," she snapped. "You clean floors, not medical records." Grace stayed calm and apologized, but the nurse's reaction told her everything. There was no room for questions. Later, Grace tried to speak with Richard. She waited until he came home early from a meeting and caught him in the hallway. She explained her concerns gently, showing him a few of the date mismatches and asking if he'd noticed them too. Richard barely glanced at the papers. "Grace, I appreciate your care for Emily, but these are top specialists. I don't have time for baseless theories," he said, brushing past her. He told her to focus on her duties and not interfere with medical decisions. That moment made it clear. Even the truth wouldn't get through if it threatened his trust in the system he'd paid for. After that, Grace knew she couldn't rely on anyone inside the house. She needed outside help. One morning, while taking out the trash, she secretly collected used vials and empty medicine bottles from Emily's room. She also saved a small blood-stained gauze pad from a recent blood draw, wrapping it carefully in foil and tucking it into her shoe. She didn't know if it would be useful, but she had to try. She called a free clinic downtown that offered second opinions for low-income families and made an appointment under a fake name, saying she was a relative of a sick child. She brought the samples and copies of the reports she'd photocopied using the office printer late at night. The doctor at the clinic, a kind man named Dr. Patel, reviewed everything carefully. He compared the treatment plan with current medical guidelines and ran tests on the blood sample. 2 days later, he called Grace back. His voice was serious but hopeful. "This child doesn't need palliative care," he said. "She's a candidate for a kidney transplant. With proper treatment, she has a real chance." Patel's notes over and over. The official team had labeled Emily as terminal, but this new evaluation said her cancer was stable enough for surgery. A transplant could save her life. So why wasn't it being offered? Grace dug deeper. She searched online for the private clinic where Emily received most of her care, Cedar Ridge Oncology, and found it was partly funded by a health investment group tied to several board members of Richard's company. She also discovered that Cedar Ridge made most of its revenue from long-term palliative programs, not from curative treatments. Transplants were expensive up front and didn't guarantee recurring income. But keeping a patient on continuous care, meds, scans, hospital stays, generated steady profits. Grace's stomach turned. It wasn't just negligence. It was a system designed to keep Emily sick just long enough to keep the money flowing. And Richard, wrapped in grief and trusting the wrong people, had no idea. She tried to think of who else might help. She considered calling the police, but she had no hard proof, just inconsistencies and a second opinion. She thought about going to the press, but that could hurt Emily more than help her. Then she remembered a nurse who'd recently quit Cedar Ridge after a public argument with the clinic's director. Grace tracked her down through a social media post and met her at a diner outside the city. The nurse, tired and wary, confirmed Grace's worst fears. "They don't want high-profile cases to recover too fast," she said quietly. "It messes with their funding model, especially when the family is rich and the insurance pays without question." She added that Emily's file had been flagged for extended care protocol the moment she was admitted. Grace asked if there was any record of transplant eligibility being discussed. The nurse shook her head. "Never. They erased that option early on. Grace left the diner with her hands shaking. This wasn't just about bad medicine, it was a deliberate choice to deny Emily a chance at life for profit. Back at the mansion, Grace watched Emily sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. The girl had started asking again about getting better, about going to school, about seeing the ocean. Grace had promised her they'd go one day. Now she knew that promise could actually come true if she could break through the wall of silence around them. The house, once just cold and empty, now felt like a trap. Every polite smile from the staff, every neatly filed report, every calm word from the doctors, it was all part of a system hiding the truth. Grace realized she was alone in this fight, but she also knew she couldn't back down. She had seen the new diagnosis with her own eyes. Emily had a chance of recovery with a kidney transplant, but this was being withheld. Grace now discovered a medical conspiracy. The profits from palliative care came from a private clinic linked to Richard's circle, and no one wanted Emily to get better. Grace waited until late evening, when the house was quiet and Richard had just returned from a business dinner. She knocked on his office door and stepped inside without waiting for a reply. In her hands, she carried a folder with printed emails, lab comparisons, Dr. Patel's second opinion, and notes from her conversation with the former nurse. She laid everything on his desk and explained calmly and clearly what she'd found. Emily was eligible for a transplant, but the clinic was hiding it to keep her in long-term palliative care. Richard listened for less than a minute before his face hardened. "You think I'm stupid?" he snapped. "You've been digging through private files, talking to strangers, and now you come here with conspiracy theories. Is this how you get a bonus?" He accused her of trying to manipulate the situation for money, maybe even to sue him later. Grace stood her ground, but he cut her off. "If you mention this again, you're fired, and don't think I won't make sure no one in this city hires you." She left the room with her head high, but her heart sank. She had told the truth, and no one in power believed her. Despite the threat, Grace stayed. She couldn't leave Emily now, not when the girl needed her most. Emily, unaware of the tension, had started calling her Aunt Grace during their bedtime talks. She'd hug her tightly every morning and ask if they could bake cookies or draw pictures together. Grace kept routines comforting and predictable. Warm baths, soft pajamas, stories about brave girls who solved mysteries. She knew Emily's body was weakening. Her energy dropped fast, and she winced when brushing her hair because so much came out in clumps. Grace switched to a soft bristle brush and washed her hair less often to reduce pain. She also started hiding vitamins and protein powder in Emily's meals, hoping to keep her strength up. The bond between them grew stronger each day, built on small acts of care that no one else in the house seemed to notice. To Emily, Grace wasn't just staff, she was family. And that made Grace even more determined to fight, even if she had to do it alone. But she wasn't entirely alone. A few days after her confrontation with Richard, Grace received a call from Dr. Sam Mitchell, a young resident who had worked briefly on Emily's care team before suddenly disappearing. He explained that he'd been fired after questioning why a transplant evaluation wasn't ordered. He'd tried to raise concerns internally, but was told to stick to his role. After leaving, he kept tabs on Emily's case from a distance. When he heard Grace was asking similar questions, he reached out. They met in a public library, far from the mansion and the clinic. Sam brought copies of internal emails and treatment logs he'd saved before his access was cut. Together, they compared notes and confirmed the same pattern. Decisions were being made based on billing codes, not medical need. Sam agreed to help Grace find a hospital willing to take Emily for an independent evaluation. They knew it would be risky, Richard could block it, and the clinic might retaliate. But they also knew time was running out. They decided to act quickly and quietly, using Sam's contacts and Grace's access to Emily's daily schedule. Emily's health continued to decline. She developed a low-grade fever that wouldn't go away, and her legs swelled from fluid retention. She slept more than usual and sometimes forgot what day it was. Grace stayed by her side constantly, adjusting pillows, offering sips of water, and holding her hand during bad nights. She also began preparing Emily gently for the idea of a new kind of treatment, not by using medical terms, but by talking about a special doctor who might help her feel strong again. Emily listened with wide eyes and asked if Aunt Grace would come with her. Grace promised she would. Meanwhile, Sam arranged a consultation at a children's hospital 2 hours away, under the guise of a routine second opinion. He found a sympathetic social worker who agreed to keep it confidential until they had Richard's permission, or until they could prove he was being misled. Grace packed a small bag with Emily's favorite things, just in case they had to leave in a hurry. Every day felt like walking on thin ice, but they had no other choice. Rumors began to spread among the house staff. The night nurse mentioned overhearing a heated phone call between Richard and the clinic director. The driver said Richard had cancelled 2 business trips and spent more time staring out the window than working. One maid whispered that she saw him crying in the garage after reading an email. Grace noticed small changes too. Richard started eating dinner at the table with Emily instead of in his office. He asked Grace, awkwardly, how Emily had been sleeping. He even stayed in the room once while she read a story, sitting silently in a chair by the door. He didn't apologize or admit doubt, but his behavior showed cracks in his certainty. The pride that had kept him from listening was now battling a deeper fear, the fear that he might have failed his daughter when she needed him most. Grace saw this shift and knew it was her only opening. She didn't push him. She just kept caring for Emily openly and honestly, letting her actions speak louder than words. Richard's internal conflict grew. He started reviewing old medical files himself, comparing dates and drug names, just as Grace had done. He called the clinic with sharper questions and got vague answers that didn't satisfy him. He even looked up Dr. Sam Mitchell and found his credentials were solid, no history of misconduct, just a disagreement over patient care. One night after Emily woke up crying from a nightmare, Richard held her for the first time in months. She whispered, "I want to get better, Daddy," and he didn't know what to say. The next morning, he asked Grace, quietly, without anger, if she'd be willing to show him everything again. She nodded. She didn't gloat or scold. She just handed him the folder. Richard, torn between pride and fear of losing his daughter, began hearing rumors among the staff and began to doubt his own convictions. The charity dinner was one of Richard's biggest events of the year, held in the mansion's grand glass dining room with over 50 guests, investors, doctors, and city officials. Grace had spent the whole week preparing, polishing silverware, arranging flowers, and making sure every detail was perfect. She didn't plan to speak to Richard during the event, but when she saw him laughing with the clinic's director near the bar, she couldn't stay silent. She approached quietly and whispered that Emily had spiked a fever and needed him. Before she could finish, Richard's face tightened. "Not now," he said sharply. But Grace insisted, mentioning the new medical findings. A nearby guest turned to look. Richard's voice rose. "You don't belong here. Go back to your duties." Humiliated, Grace stood frozen as the security guard stepped forward and escorted her out in front of everyone. She kept her head down, but her hands shook. What hurt most wasn't the embarrassment. It was knowing Emily might have seen it. Emily had been watching from the top of the stairs, wrapped in a blanket, too weak to join the party, but curious about the noise. She saw Grace being led away like a criminal and didn't understand why. Her breathing quickened, her chest tightened, and she began to cry uncontrollably. The housekeeper who found her tried to calm her down, but Emily kept repeating, "They hurt Aunt Grace, they hurt Aunt Grace." She refused to eat, wouldn't let anyone touch her, and curled into a ball on her bed, shaking. Her emotional distress triggered physical symptoms. Her heart rate spiked and her oxygen levels dropped. A nurse was called, but even sedatives didn't help much. Richard, still in his tuxedo, finally came upstairs hours later after the guests had left. He found Emily pale and exhausted, whispering Grace's name in her sleep. For the first time, he felt a sharp pang of guilt. He hadn't just dismissed an employee, he'd broken his daughter's trust in front of her. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced the hallway, replaying the scene in his head, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. The next morning, Richard went to Emily's room early, before anyone else was awake. He found her bed empty and followed soft voices to the bathroom. Grace was there, kneeling beside Emily, gently brushing her thin hair. On the counter sat a small wig, soft, brown, and carefully styled. Grace had cut pieces of her own hair and woven them with synthetic strands to make something that looked natural and comfortable. She was showing Emily how to wear it without pulling on her scalp. Emily giggled when it slipped sideways, and Grace laughed too, adjusting it with care. Richard watched from the doorway, unseen. He noticed how Grace's hands moved slowly and patiently, how she spoke in a calm, warm tone, how Emily's eyes lit up with each word. He also saw the stack of medical folders tucked under Emily's pillow, Grace's notes, printed reports, and Dr. Patel's letter. Richard quietly took them and flipped through page after page, his stomach sinking as he realized everything Grace had said was backed by facts, not fiction. He spent the rest of the morning in his study, cross-checking names, dates, and treatment codes. He called 2 independent hospitals and asked about transplant eligibility for Emily's condition. Both confirmed she was a candidate. He even reached out to a former colleague who worked in healthcare regulation, who told him Cedar Ridge had been under informal review for billing irregularities. Richard felt sick. He had trusted the wrong people because it was easier than facing his grief. He had let his daughter suffer while he hid behind money and status. Meanwhile, Grace continued caring for Emily as if nothing had happened the night before. She helped her wash her face, picked out her favorite dress, and made her a small breakfast with extra honey in her tea, just how she liked it. Grace never mentioned the dinner or the guard. She just focused on making Emily feel safe again, showing her that love didn't disappear after one bad moment. Later that afternoon, Grace sat on the edge of Emily's bed, helping her try on the wig one more time. Emily looked in the mirror, touched the soft strands, and smiled, a real, bright smile that reached her eyes. "It's pretty," she said softly. Then she turned to Grace, reached up and cupped her face with both hands. "I love you, Mommy," she whispered. The words weren't planned or rehearsed. They came from a place of pure feeling. Grace froze for a second, tears welling up, but she didn't correct her. She just hugged Emily gently and whispered back, "I love you too, baby." In that moment, all the pain, fear, and exhaustion faded. It wasn't about titles or roles. It was about who showed up, who stayed, who loved without conditions. Grace had become the mother Emily needed, not by replacing anyone, but by filling the space left empty by grief and absence. She held her close, rocking slightly as Emily drifted into a peaceful nap. Richard had walked down the hall to check on Emily and stopped just outside the door when he heard those words. He stood there unseen, his hand on the doorknob, as his daughter called Grace Mommy with pure love in her voice. Something inside him broke open. All his pride, his need to control everything, his belief that money could fix anything, it all collapsed in that instant. He leaned against the wall, tears streaming down his face, unable to move. He finally saw the truth. Grace wasn't after his money or his name. She was there because she cared, deeply, selflessly, consistently, and while he'd been building empires, she'd been saving his daughter's spirit. The cold, composed billionaire mask slipped away, revealing the broken father underneath. For the first time in years, he saw what truly mattered, and who was truly caring for his daughter. The image of his daughter calling Grace Mommy stayed with Richard long after he left the hallway. He couldn't eat, couldn't focus, couldn't pretend everything was fine. That night, he sat alone in his office, replaying every moment he'd missed with Emily. The birthdays, the hospital visits, the quiet nights when she needed him most. He realized Grace hadn't taken his place. She'd simply filled the void he'd left behind. The next morning, he found Grace in the kitchen, preparing oatmeal for Emily. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, looking tired and ashamed. Then he said, "I'm sorry." It was a simple sentence, but it carried everything. Regret for doubting her, for humiliating her, for not seeing what was right in front of him. Grace looked up, surprised, but didn't say anything right away. She just nodded slowly, her eyes soft. Richard asked if they could talk, and for the first time, he truly listened. He heard about the second opinion, the hidden records, the clinic's refusal to consider a transplant. And then Grace dropped the most shocking truth. She was a compatible kidney donor. Grace explained that during her own routine checkup months earlier, she'd secretly asked to be tested for compatibility with Emily. The results came back positive. Her blood type matched, and her tissue markers were close enough for a successful transplant. She'd kept it to herself because she knew Richard wouldn't believe her, and she didn't want to create false hope. But now, with time running out, she was ready to go through with the surgery, even if Richard didn't support it. She told him she'd already spoken to Dr. Sam, who confirmed the procedure was urgent. Emily's kidneys were failing faster than expected, and without a transplant within weeks, she wouldn't survive. Richard was stunned. He'd been so focused on money and control that he never imagined someone would risk their own health for his daughter out of pure love. He asked if she was sure, and Grace simply said, "She's my child too." In that moment, Richard saw not just a caregiver, but a woman willing to give part of herself to save a life. But their path wasn't clear. When Richard contacted Cedar Ridge to schedule the transplant, the clinic refused. They claimed there was no legal or ethical basis to perform a major surgery using an employee as a donor, citing conflicts of interest and potential coercion. Richard argued that Grace was acting voluntarily, but the clinic stood firm. He demanded to speak with the medical director, only to be told the decision came from higher up, the ownership group. That's when Richard dug deeper into the clinic's financial structure. He pulled old partnership agreements and discovered that his longtime business partner, Victor Lang, was not just an investor, but a silent co-owner of Cedar Ridge. Worse, internal emails showed Victor had personally blocked transplant approvals for high-profile patients to keep them in the palliative program longer. Richard felt sick. His own partner had profited from his daughter's suffering. He confronted Victor in a heated phone call, then immediately filed paperwork to dissolve their business relationship. He didn't care about the fallout. He only cared about saving Emily. Furious and heartbroken, Richard decided to go public. He contacted a trusted journalist he'd known for years and shared everything: the falsified reports, the financial incentives, the blocked transplant, and Grace's willingness to donate. Within 48 hours, the story exploded online. News outlets picked it up, calling it the Glass House Scandal. Social media filled with outrage. People shared Emily's photo, demanded justice, and praised Grace as a hero. The state medical board launched an emergency investigation, and a federal health watchdog opened a separate probe into Cedar Ridge's billing practices. Most importantly, a family court judge, moved by the case, issued a temporary order overriding the clinic's refusal. The court ruled that Grace's consent was valid, her compatibility confirmed, and Emily's life in immediate danger. The surgery was approved. Hospitals across the state offered operating rooms and teams. Dr. Sam coordinated everything, working around the clock to prepare. For the first time in months, there was real hope. Emily had a chance, not just a slim possibility, but a clear, actionable path to recovery. But even with legal approval and medical backing, one question remained unanswered. Would Grace go through with it? Donating a kidney is major surgery. It carries risks: infection, blood loss, long recovery, and possible future health complications. Grace was in her late 50s, not young, and though healthy, she wasn't invincible. Richard asked her again, this time not as an employer, but as a father begging for help. Grace didn't hesitate. "I've already made peace with it," she said. She explained that she'd spoken to her pastor, updated her will, and even arranged for her sister to come stay at the house during her recovery. She wasn't doing it for fame or thanks. She was doing it because Emily had become her heart. Still, the medical team needed her final formal consent after a psychological evaluation. The day before the assessment, Grace sat with Emily in the garden. The girl, weak but alert, held Grace's hand and asked, "Will you still be here after the doctor fixes me?" Grace smiled and said, "Always." But inside she was scared, not of the surgery, but of failing Emily if something went wrong. The hospital scheduled the evaluation for Friday morning. Grace arrived early, dressed simply, carrying her ID and medical records. She answered every question honestly. Yes, she understood the risks. Yes, no one was forcing her. Yes, she wanted to do this out of love. The psychologist watched her closely, looking for signs of pressure or instability, but found only calm determination. After 2 hours, the evaluation was complete. The team would review the results and give a final go-ahead by the end of the day. Back at the mansion, Richard paced the living room, checking his phone every few minutes. Emily slept upstairs, unaware of the decision hanging in the balance. Grace returned quietly, made tea, and sat by the window, staring at the sky. She didn't speak much. She had done all she could. Now it was out of her hands. The courts had approved the surgery. The doctors were ready. Emily had a chance. But no one knew if Grace would resist the donation. The surgery was scheduled for 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, just 3 days after the court's approval. The hospital moved quickly because Emily's condition had worsened. Her blood pressure was unstable and her kidneys were barely functioning. Grace arrived the night before for final tests and prep. She didn't show fear, but her hands trembled slightly as she signed the consent forms. Emily, though scared, kept asking if Mommy Grace would be in the room when she woke up. Nurses explained they'd be in separate recovery areas, but Grace promised to see her as soon as she could. That evening, Grace sat alone in her hospital room and wrote a letter. She addressed it to Emily in case something went wrong. In simple, clear words, she explained that giving her kidney wasn't a sacrifice, it was a gift she wanted to give. She wrote that Emily had shown her kindness when she had none left, and that love had healed her own heart. She ended with, "No matter what happens, know that you are loved more than anything in this world." She sealed the letter and gave it to Dr. Sam for safekeeping. Emily spent her last night before surgery in a small hospital room decorated with drawings Grace had helped her make. Richard stayed with her the whole time, something he hadn't done since she was a toddler. He read her a story, adjusted her IV line when it tugged, and held her hand when she cried from pain. He didn't check his phone once. When she finally fell asleep, he sat in the chair beside her bed, watching her breathe. He thought about all the nights he'd missed, all the times he chose work over her. Now, faced with the possibility of losing her or losing Grace, he realized how little his success mattered without them. At 4 a.m., nurses came to prep Emily for surgery. Richard walked with her gurney to the operating wing, holding her hand until the doors closed. He then went to the waiting area, where Grace was being wheeled in from the other direction. Their eyes met. Grace gave him a small nod. He whispered, "Thank you," and she smiled faintly before disappearing behind another set of doors. The surgery lasted over 6 hours. Richard paced the hallway, drank bad coffee, and answered calls from worried friends and reporters. Doctor. Sam updated him twice, once after Grace's kidney was successfully removed, and again when the transplant into Emily began. Each update brought relief, but no certainty. Richard sat down only when his legs gave out. He prayed, though he hadn't done so in years. He thought about his wife, about how she would have fought for Emily with everything she had. He wondered if Grace felt the same fierce love and realized she already had, every single day. Finally, just after 1 p.m., the lead surgeon came out. Both patients were stable. The kidney was working. There were no complications. Richard exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. He asked to see Emily first. The nurse said she was still groggy, but awake. He walked into her room slowly, afraid of what he'd see. But there she was, pale but alert, her eyes searching the room. Emily's voice was weak but clear. "Where's Mommy Grace?" That was the first thing she said when she opened her eyes. Richard's throat tightened. He sat on the edge of her bed and gently brushed her forehead. "She's okay," he said. "She's resting. She gave you a part of her so you could get better." Emily nodded slowly, as if she already understood. Then she looked at her father, really looked at him, and whispered, "Stay." Richard nodded, tears spilling over. He hadn't cried like this since his wife died, not in front of anyone, not without holding back. But now, in this sterile hospital room filled with beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic, he let it all out. He held his daughter's hand and promised out loud that he would never leave her side again. He would be the father she deserved, present, involved, and full of love, not just money and empty promises. Later that afternoon, once Grace was awake and stable, Richard asked if he could bring Emily to see her. The nurses said it was too soon for walking, but they could wheel Emily's bed into Grace's room for a few minutes. When the door opened and Emily saw Grace lying in the next bed, her face lit up despite the pain. Grace, pale and hooked to monitors, turned her head slowly and smiled. Emily reached out her hand and Grace took it gently. Neither said much. They didn't need to. After a quiet moment, Emily whispered, "I love you, Mommy." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she squeezed Emily's hand and whispered back, "I love you too, baby." Richard stood by the window watching them. He didn't feel jealousy or confusion, only gratitude. He saw what real love looked like, not grand gestures, but quiet presence, sacrifice, and consistency. In that moment, he understood that family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up when it matters most. Grace was still weak, her body sore from surgery, but seeing Emily alive and talking gave her strength. She watched the girl's chest rise and fall, listened to her soft breathing, and felt a deep peace settle over her. Emily, even in pain, smiled back, "I love you, Mommy." It wasn't just a child's way of saying thank you. It was a bond forged through shared fear, trust, and unconditional care. For Grace, it meant she hadn't just saved a life. She'd found a new one. And for Richard, it was the beginning of a different future, one where he wouldn't just provide for his daughter, but truly be there for her. That morning, he promised himself he would be a different father, present and true. Grace, still weak, smiled when she saw Emily alive. And the girl, even in pain, smiled back, "I love you, Mommy." It was more than gratitude, it was family. Months after the surgery, Emily ran around the mansion's garden with short hair just beginning to grow in. It was patchy in places, curly in others, but she didn't care. She was too busy chasing butterflies and laughing as Grace called her to slow down. Her energy had returned slowly but steadily, and now she could climb trees, ride her bike, and even swim in the backyard pool under Grace's watchful eye. Richard watched from the patio, no longer in a suit but in jeans and a t-shirt, holding a cup of coffee he'd made himself. The garden, once perfectly manicured and empty, now had toys scattered on the grass, a tire swing hanging from the old oak, and a picnic blanket with half-eaten sandwiches. Emily's laughter filled the air, something that hadn't been heard in the house for years. Richard had made big changes. He fired every staff member tied to the clinic scheme, including the head nurse and the house manager who'd ignored Grace's concerns. He also cut all business ties with Victor Lang and donated millions to patient advocacy groups. Richard transformed the house in more ways than one. He turned his old office into a playroom filled with books, art supplies, and board games. He moved his work setup to a small desk in the kitchen so he could be near Emily while she did homework or helped Grace cook. He attended every doctor's appointment, learned how to check her medication schedule, and even started therapy to deal with his grief and guilt. Most importantly, he listened, really listened, when Emily talked about her day, her dreams, or her fears. He stopped checking emails during dinner and made it a rule that weekends were for family only. Grace stayed on, not as a maid or a nanny, but as part of the family. After months of legal paperwork and court hearings, Richard formally named her Emily's co-guardian. It wasn't just symbolic. He wanted her to have full say in every decision about Emily's life, from school choices to medical care. The judge approved it quickly, moved by their story. Grace didn't ask for it, but she accepted it as a responsibility, not a reward. Dr. Sam, with Richard's full financial backing, opened a new pediatric clinic focused on children with rare diseases. It was called the Emily Grace Center, and its mission was clear: no child would be denied treatment based on profit or status. The clinic offered second opinions, financial aid, and transparent care plans. Sam hired doctors who valued ethics over billing codes and built a team that included social workers and counselors. Grace visited often, not as a patient, but as an advisor. She helped design family waiting rooms that felt warm and welcoming, not cold and clinical. She also trained new staff on how to talk to scared children and worried parents. The clinic became a model for ethical care, and other hospitals began adopting its practices. Richard didn't seek credit. He just wanted to make sure no other family went through what they had. He funded research into Emily's type of cancer and created a scholarship for nurses who advocated for patients. The scandal had shaken the medical community, but from it grew something good. Grace became known across the country as a symbol of hope. Medical organizations invited her to speak at conferences, and news outlets wanted interviews. She was awarded honors from health advocacy groups and even received a letter from the governor. But Grace turned down almost all of it. She didn't want fame or praise. When a national magazine asked for a photo shoot, she politely declined. "I'm not a hero," she told Richard once. "I just did what anyone would do for someone they love." She preferred quiet mornings making pancakes, helping Emily with spelling words, or sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. The only public thing she agreed to was a short video for the new clinic, where she simply said, "Listen to the people who care for your children. Sometimes they see what you can't." That clip went viral, not because of dramatic words, but because of her honesty. People saw in her the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return. Inside the mansion, life settled into a new rhythm. Mornings started with Emily running into Grace's room to wake her up, followed by breakfast with Richard at the table. Evenings were for walks, puzzles, or movies with popcorn. The house no longer echoed with silence. It buzzed with conversation, music, and the occasional argument over whose turn it was to feed the goldfish. Richard stopped hosting flashy charity events and instead held small gatherings for families from the clinic, creating a community of support. He also started taking Emily to her mother's grave every month, where they'd leave flowers and talk about her. Grace always came too, never pushing, just standing nearby if Emily wanted to hold her hand. The girl was thriving, not just physically but emotionally. She made friends at school, joined a soccer team, and even started writing stories about a brave woman named Aunt Grace who saved the world with kindness. For the first time, the mansion wasn't cold. It was a home. And this was built with courage, love, and the strength of a woman who never gave up. Grace had walked into a house full of grief and walked out with a family. She didn't change the world with speeches or money. She changed one life with patience, truth, and daily acts of care. Richard learned that being a father meant more than providing. It meant showing up, staying present, and trusting the right people. Emily, once fading quietly in a glass cage, now ran freely under the sun, her laughter proof that healing was possible. The mansion still had its glass walls, but now they reflected light instead of emptiness. Inside there was warmth, noise, mess, and love. The kind that doesn't need to be said out loud because it's shown every single day. For the first time, the mansion wasn't cold. It was a home. And this was built with courage, love, and the strength of a woman who never gave up. As life blossomed in the glass mansion, peace was short-lived. Just as Emily started first grade and Grace settled into her role as co-guardian, the past came knocking. Richard's former business partner, Victor Lang, humiliated by the media exposure and stripped of his medical investments, struck back. He filed a lawsuit against Grace, accusing her of emotional manipulation and undue influence over Emily, claiming she had used the child's vulnerability to gain legal rights and financial benefits. The case made headlines again. Maid turned guardian under fire, one tabloid read. Reporters camped outside the mansion, shouting questions and snapping photos of Emily walking to the car. Grace refused to speak to them, keeping Emily indoors more often and cancelling public appearances. Richard, furious but calm, hired a top legal team immediately. He knew this wasn't about justice, it was about revenge. Victor had lost everything, his reputation, his board seats, even his medical license. Now he wanted to drag Grace through the mud to feel powerful again. The press returned with a vengeance. Old photos of Grace in her maid uniform were splashed across news sites, twisted to suggest she had schemed her way into the family. Talk shows debated whether a housekeeper could truly love a child like a mother. Social media filled with cruel comments, though many also defended Grace, sharing stories of nurses, teachers, and caregivers who had become family. Inside the house, tension grew. Emily, confused by the noise, asked Grace if she'd done something wrong. Grace knelt and looked her in the eyes. "No, baby," she said. "We did everything right. Sometimes people who do bad things try to make good people look bad so they don't feel guilty." Richard held family meetings every night, explaining in simple terms what was happening and reassuring Emily that no one could take Grace away. He also made a bold decision. He would not hide behind lawyers. He would speak publicly and tell the whole truth, even if it exposed his own failures. At a press conference outside the new clinic, Richard stood alone at the podium. No PR team, no script. He spoke plainly. "For years, I ignored my daughter. I was grieving, yes, but that's no excuse. I let strangers care for her while I chased success. Grace wasn't hired to be a mother. She became one because no one else was there." He revealed how he'd dismissed her concerns, humiliated her at a dinner, and almost let his daughter die because he trusted the wrong people. "If it weren't for that woman," he said, voice breaking, "Emily would be dead, not because of the illness, but because I failed her." The room fell silent. Cameras stopped flashing. Reporters lowered their notepads. For the first time, the public saw not a billionaire, but a broken father who had finally woken up. The narrative shifted overnight. Grace was no longer the maid who took advantage. She was the woman who saved a child when everyone else looked away. The trial began 3 weeks later in a packed courtroom. Victor's lawyers painted Grace as opportunistic, pointing to her legal guardianship and the media attention as proof of ulterior motives. They questioned why a woman with no blood relation would donate a kidney unless she expected something in return. Richard's team countered with medical records, witness statements from nurses, and Dr. Sam's testimony about the blocked transplant. But the most powerful moment came unexpectedly. The judge, moved by the unusual circumstances, allowed Emily, just 7 years old, to speak, after confirming she understood the importance of telling the truth. Small and pale but steady, Emily walked to the stand in a yellow dress Grace had picked out. She didn't cry. She looked at Grace, then at the jury, and said clearly, "She gave me life twice, the first time when she loved me, the second when she saved me." The words hung in the air. Even Victor's lawyer looked away. The courtroom fell silent. No one whispered, no one moved. It was the kind of truth that couldn't be argued with. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Grace was acquitted of all charges. The judge called the lawsuit frivolous and malicious and ordered Victor to pay all legal fees. But the story didn't end there. Federal investigators, already reviewing Cedar Ridge's records, used evidence from the trial to file criminal charges against Victor for fraud, falsifying medical records, and endangering a minor through medical neglect. Within a month, he was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to prison. His assets were seized, and the clinic was permanently shut down. The medical board revoked licenses for 2 other doctors involved. Justice, slow and imperfect, finally arrived. For the public, the case became a cautionary tale about profit-driven healthcare. Documentaries were made, laws were reviewed, and hospitals tightened oversight on palliative care protocols. But for those who lived it, the real victory wasn't in court. It was in the quiet moments afterward, when the cameras left and life could finally breathe again. Back at the mansion, Grace and Emily sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies blink in the dusk. The lawsuit was over, the headlines faded, and the front gate was finally quiet. Emily leaned her head on Grace's shoulder and asked, "Are we safe now?" Grace kissed the top of her head and said, "Yes, baby, we're safe." Richard joined them a few minutes later, carrying 3 mugs of hot chocolate. He didn't say much, just sat beside them, letting the peace settle in. The past had tried to pull them apart, but it only made their bond stronger. For some, the story ended with the verdict. But for Grace and Emily, it was only the beginning. They had years of laughter, school plays, scraped knees, and bedtime stories ahead. They had a future built not on secrets or status, but on truth, trust, and the kind of love that shows up, even when no one is watching. The story ended there for some, but for Grace and Emily, it was only the beginning. 5 years passed. Emily was now a healthy teenager, full of dreams and energy. At 12 years old, she stood taller, her hair thick and wavy, her cheeks flushed with color from soccer practice and late-night study sessions. She laughed loudly, argued passionately about climate change in class, and kept a journal filled with story ideas and song lyrics. Every morning, she and Grace shared coffee, decaf for Emily, at the kitchen table while Richard made breakfast, usually slightly burnt toast, but always with love. Grace had been there for every milestone. The science fair where Emily's volcano erupted too early, the school play where she played a tree but stole the show with her facial expressions, and the tearful night she got her first period. Grace didn't just care for her, she guided her, corrected her when she was wrong, and celebrated her when she succeeded. Their bond wasn't built on perfection, but on showing up day after day through awkward phases, teenage moods, and growing pains. Grace was by her side every step of the way, during school presentations, during her first crushes, through triumphs and fears. When Emily panicked before her first piano recital, Grace sat in the front row and mouthed, "You've got this," between songs. When she cried over a failed math test, Grace helped her make a study plan and stayed up late, quizzing her. When she developed her first crush on a boy named Leo, Grace listened without judgment and gently reminded her that her worth wasn't tied to anyone's attention. She also set boundaries. No phones at dinner, homework before screen time, honesty above all. Emily sometimes rolled her eyes, but deep down she knew Grace's rules came from love, not control. Richard supported Grace fully, never undermining her authority. He'd learned that parenting wasn't about being the fun dad. It was about teamwork, consistency, and putting Emily's needs first. The three of them ate dinner together almost every night, talked about their days, and planned weekend hikes or movie marathons. The mansion no longer felt like a showpiece. It felt lived in, messy, and real. Richard, transformed, became a speaker on fatherhood and business ethics. He stepped down as CEO of his company and took on a role as chairman, focusing on mentorship and ethical investing. He traveled to conferences, not to pitch products, but to share his story, how grief blinded him, how pride nearly cost him his daughter, and how one woman's quiet courage changed everything. He spoke about the dangers of putting profit over people, especially in healthcare, and urged companies to prioritize transparency. His talks weren't polished performances, they were raw, honest reflections that often left audiences in tears. He also started a foundation that funded legal aid for families facing medical neglect and supported caregiver training programs. Most importantly, he made sure Emily knew he was proud of her, not for her grades or achievements, but for her kindness, her curiosity, and her resilience. He told her often, "You're the best thing I've ever been part of," and meant it with every word. The Ellington family story became a book, a film, and an inspiration. A journalist who had covered the trial wrote a best-selling memoir titled The Glass House That Learned to Love, which was later adapted into a widely praised movie. Grace refused to profit from it, but agreed to the project only if proceeds went to the Emily Grace Center. The film showed the truth. No glamorized drama, just the hard, quiet work of love and justice. Schools used it in ethics classes. Hospitals screened it for staff training. Strangers wrote letters saying it gave them hope or pushed them to speak up in their own workplaces. But at home, life stayed simple. Emily teased Grace about being famous, but Grace just laughed and reminded her to take out the trash. Richard kept a copy of the book on his nightstand, not for pride, but as a reminder of how far they'd come. The attention never changed their routine. Homework, chores, Sunday pancakes, and Friday movie nights remained sacred. Upon being accepted to university, Emily gave a speech at her middle school graduation. She stood at the podium in a blue dress, hands steady, voice clear. "Everyone has a mother who gives birth," she began, "but not everyone has a mother who chooses to love. Mine didn't have to. She could have walked away when things got hard, but she stayed. She fought for me when no one else would. She gave me her time, her heart, and even part of her body. That's not just love, that's courage." The audience, parents, teachers, students, sat in stunned silence for a beat, then rose to their feet. The standing ovation lasted over a minute. Grace, sitting in the third row between Richard and Dr. Sam, covered her face with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She hadn't expected this. She'd never asked for recognition. But hearing Emily call her mother in front of everyone, without hesitation, without shame, filled her with a peace she'd never known. In that moment, all the pain, fear, and sleepless nights faded into something beautiful. That day she knew she was no longer the maid. She was the mother. The title wasn't given by a court or a headline. It was earned through years of showing up, sacrificing, and loving without conditions. The life that began with pain and distrust now blossomed with love and respect. Emily saw her not as a replacement, but as her true mom, the one who held her through chemo, braided her hair for school pictures, and whispered, "I'm proud of you," after every stumble. Richard saw her as his partner in parenting, his friend, and the heart of their home. And Grace finally saw herself not as an outsider who stumbled into a rich family's tragedy, but as the woman who helped rebuild it with honesty and care. They didn't need grand gestures or public praise to be a family. They had built something real, quiet, and unshakable. And together, they continued as what they had always been, a family. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.